webinar on the respiratory medicine relocation. Thank you all for joining us. This is our first webinar for Alfred Health, so it's a really exciting way to bring information out to what we hope is a broader consumer group. We've got a bit of an agenda today. My name's Kathleen Fallon. I'm the Clinical Service Director for Cancer and Medical Specialties, of which respiratory medicine is part of our program. Today we're going to take you through two broad aspects to talk through. We're going to look at the design and bring the latest design to you, looking at how we've incorporated feedback, your feedback into the design along the way. And myself and Megan from Architect Inc. will be talking through the design and looking at that in a more granular way in relation to your feedback. Then we're going to ask Greg Snell and Dominic Keating from Lung Transplant and CF to talk through the different patient pathways we've been developing in order to ensure we minimise the risk of patient cross-infection, but also provide avenues for patients to get timely access to services. Remembering that our overarching goals were to ensure that we retained all the clinical functions and where possible enhanced or expanded those functions, and whilst doing that ensuring that we continue to provide high quality care. This is a pretty busy slide. This takes us through the process to date. For many of you will remember we started back in July and we started trying to design an appropriate space to relocate respiratory services. We've worked with the architects along the way and also our patient reference group and the CF advisory group over this time to refine our design. We've sent out along the way some information through newsletters to both patients and staff. And we're now at the design validation phase. So we're bringing to you today what is nearing our last design for your final input and feedback in relation to that design. Just take you back to the design principles that we agreed on at the start of the project, and these really reflected what we heard from our patients about what was important to them. And one of those was that the waiting areas were designed for patient access to oxygen, they were visible and they were well zoned. We wanted to ensure that patients received timely care with minimal waits and that that care was coordinated. We wanted the physical environment to be comfortable and accessible with easy access to facilities, improved seating and where possible natural light. We wanted to ensure that the fabric improved our infection prevention through better use of materials and access. And we wanted to enhance patient flow and proximity to services, in particular lung function and pathology. We also wanted to maintain access to the highly skilled and professional staff of the respiratory services. So we're going to move on and have a look at the design and how we've incorporated your feedback into the design along the way. So Megan's going to help me in terms of talking through the process of coming up with the current design and how that's providing for the concerns that patients raised along the way and what's important to them. So just looking at the broad new design, this is a pretty busy slide and I'm going to draw your attention to the blue areas, which are the clinical areas really in the broad footprint. Just to note that the light green sort of shaded areas is where the majority of the clinical teams will be. But the clinic spaces will be in the blue, and you can see that they're divided across two main buildings. This is going to be a new build, so we believe the facilities will improve in terms of fabric and furniture and fittings, and that we've retained some proximity to the clinical teams where possible. So I'm going to hand you over to Megan, who is going to talk through how she's come up with this design, incorporating the feedback along the way. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us, but what I wanted to talk a bit about was the general broad overlay of the elements that we've provided in this scheme. The building, as Ketley's mentioned, is over 2 buildings, and that is the left-hand side, which is called the Eastern Respiratory Block, and then there's Philip Block respiratory. So with those elements, we have incorporated, we've actually got 2 lift lobbies. So we've incorporated to the east, which is the left-hand side of the screen, the green zone, which is the workplace zone. That is where the back of house essentially is, and then the blues, which is the clinic spaces. So the first thing that we wanted to talk about was waiting areas, and the waiting areas are, there is 2. On the east block, there is a minimal waiting area because that is where we've located an isolation clinic. So that is for more of the higher risk areas. And then we've got to the Philip block, the other clinics, and that can be accessed from the lifts in the Philip block. The reception and waiting area, we've been working very hard with these guys, and we're still working a bit more on trying to finalise some of the operations around that. But at the moment, you can see it is it's like a salmon pink colour, and then the reception is directly off the lifts. So what we've done is put access to oxygen within those waiting areas, and we've also zoned the waiting areas from some of the outpatients clinics. So the idea is to create a people-centred space that makes people feel welcomed, invited, calm, less sort of stress, and it is really all about making contemporary space that makes people feel less stressed. Yeah. So I think if we go to the next slide, we wanted to talk a little bit about infection prevention. So we talked about the 2 spaces being the 2 sides of the building. The left-hand side is those isolation clinics which actually have toilets associated with them. So that is providing a bit of amenity for people not having to leave rooms, and they can contain potential infection issues. It's isolated, and it also can be designed to be very minimal in its appearance, and cleanliness is really important for those areas. On the on the Philip block side, you can see that we've got a bit of a buffer zone. That is a separation that can also be used as entry from the other clinics, but it enables you to have a bit of a buffer. To the other side, we've then got I think some large clinics and some standard size clinics for those areas. The idea is to keep the materials and the finishes very clean and easy to maintain and very contemporary. So the next slide is the access to interdisciplinary staff. Now, we've created in this scenario a very modern workplace which is co-located with the clinics, but it also enables the teams to be collaborative and learning and share knowledge and information. So that's really important in creating an environment that is best outcome for the patients. So you can see the green areas are housing those respiratory staff. Yeah, I think the other point I think is the CF team is actually going to be staying in the 5 East, but that is close to the inpatients section. So I think if we look at the next slide, I think we're looking at some comfort and accessibility. Now, those elements that we really wanted to take into consideration, we're talking about people-centred design, is making sure that we have areas that have access to natural light, access to amenities. So there's toilets within those isolation clinics, but also within the waiting area of the on the west, sorry, it's not the Western block, the Philip block. And then also creating area where we can have a drink fountain at those waiting areas, and I believe that there's going to be volunteer tea and coffee facilities within that area, so it's creating a nice amenity for comfort, being able to be seen, being able to access the facilities that you need to, and to have a nicer environment. So we're looking at warm and natural sort of materials, which are currently in the process of being delivered.
Thanks, Megan. I think some of the other challenges that we needed to address was how do we ensure that patients flow through the clinics in a timely way, and how do we ensure that there's services that people require when they attend the clinics on site, so incorporating lung function, spirometry, pathology, etc. So you can see that we've got lung function available in some of the clinic space on the blue area in the Phillip block, and we're also investigating how we service spirometry in the isolation clinics, either through opportunities for patients to have that facility at home if the technology is available, or that we come to the room and provide spirometry in the clinic space so patients don't need to move. The other thing we've incorporated is in the nurses' treatment room the ability for pathology to be taken, and a chute that goes directly to pathology so that patients don't need to routinely attend pathology in another area of the hospital. Ideally, pathology before patients come to clinic or just after it will be important, but I think one of the challenges that we've got now is how do we actually ensure that scheduling is appropriate so that people aren't waiting. So we're talking about timely care. We have provided a 20% increase in the allocation of clinic rooms. We've ensured that oxygen and medical air is available throughout all the clinics and also in the waiting space, which I think is important for many of the patients in this group. And we've got 16 clinical rooms, which includes the nurses' treatment room, which incorporates space for 2 patients. The plan for early 2018 is to start working on our redesign, and I'll talk about that a bit more in next steps. I just wanted to draw your attention to another piece of work which is concurrently happening alongside the relocation of the clinic space, is the relocation of the sleep centre. This is a very early diagram of the proposed new sleep labs. The sleep rooms you can see in blue. So there's facilities for 4 sleep rooms, each incorporating access to either an ensuite bathroom or a bathroom adjacent to the doorway. So I think there's some really positive gains to be made in terms of the sleep lab and upgrading that facility, particularly for patients staying overnight and accessing those facilities. Still early days, and we've got a bit of work to do around more detailed design, but that's what the current sleep lab is looking like in terms of the footprint. We're going to talk to you a little bit now about how we are looking at minimising the risk of infection prevention and developing patient pathways for patients to access these new facilities, flow through the system and exit in a timely way. So I'm going to ask Professor Greg Snell, who's the head of lung transplant, to talk about the pathway for lung transplantation patients. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you. So we have a couple of differences to the way we're currently working, but most of our patients will be seen in the same sort of fashion. So typically patients have bloods before coming to see us that will remain the same. There are processes in place to try and improve that even, so that bloods are coming into the Alfred from where people live. Patients will come to their appointment and they'll travel up in general to the main Phillip block lifts to the right of the screen that we talked about. They will be checking in at reception, likely touching base with a nurse to triage some of the activities of the morning, and then going on to have the standard sort of things that happen in our clinic, where we measure the lung function, where we see some of the allied health, etc., and go through the appointments, and then we'll exit via pharmacy in a standard sort of fashion, possibly with bloods being taken for special bloods by the nurses. So that's pretty standard. There are a couple of variations. One is that someone who has a known infection risk in the background, someone perhaps we've been following for years who's got a particular bug, we are able to take advantage of those infection rooms, and that patients can be routinely seen in those, as we'll see children in there was one room marked in dark blue. So we will be booking people into those rooms with particular bugs. It's also true that with the infection rooms we can actually start to triage people who are coming in with infections, and this has been particularly of note this year where we've had a lot of viruses and bugs going around, and the ability in the future to be able to take phone calls from patients who are worried that their situation is changing or they're not feeling well, and we can bring you straight through as a booked patient into one of those infection rooms, and as you'll hear about for cystic fibrosis, patients will be able to then sort of have their whole treatment there, and that'll be safer for the patient because they're getting they're in the one spot, not having to worry about moving around if they're feeling unwell, and obviously better for everyone else in the clinic at the same time, so that we're minimising the risk of cross-infection. We'll be asking people to wear masks, perhaps picked up at the desk, but certainly available in the rooms for those infectious patients, only those infectious patients. The alternative pathways from that point would include assessment and sending home, assessment and going as a sort of pre-admission bed on the ward that's currently under planning, or even potentially to the emergency department, obviously, if someone needs a little bit more assistance. So overall, most patients will go through exactly the pathway they've been through. A number will be routinely triaged to the infection rooms, and some who are more unwell will definitely be able to focus on in specially built rooms.
Thanks, Craig. I'm going to ask Dr. Dominic Keating to come up. Dominic works with the CF team, he's a CF physician, and he's going to talk about the CF pathway for patients. Thanks, Dominic.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us on the webinar. At an exciting time for cystic fibrosis, to be honest with you. We get to change to a new model of infection care that's second to none. So with that in mind, I'm just going to talk you through some of these slides. Your appointment will be booked, as it currently is, through the outpatient clinics from previously, but you might have your pathology done before you come to the hospital on the day, or you may have your lung function done before the day. From the day of the appointment, the important bit is that as you come into the hospital, you will now be wearing a mask. We also are changing to a point where you will actually be checking in as early as possible through that flow through the hospital, so at the point of contact with the hospital, but then you will wait to actually receive an SMS message. So this is using modern technology to improve infection control. Once you get that SMS message, you can then flow through to the actual lifts, which are going to be in the east block. That was to the left-hand side of the map that you saw earlier on of the hospital. When you come up through that lift, you then get out on the second floor and you actually go straight into the room. So this is where the model is changing. So instead of you actually going from room to room, you will actually now have a room that's allocated to you, and then all the staff will come to you. And so in that, we will actually be doing spirometry if you haven't had it prior to the appointment date. And then, as Kathleen said earlier on, that may change depending on technology as to whether it's done with a spirometer with us, or you have a home spirometer and actually you bring your values into us. Whatever the technology is, we will use it to minimize infection. So after you've actually been seen, all the allied health have actually seen you, you can then leave the clinic appointment and then pick up your pharmacy medications. And that's the general flow. And we will try to maximize that in terms of actually preventing infection transmission throughout the cohort. I would also like to point out from the previous slide that Greg was talking about in the acute scenario, that it still hasn't changed from what we currently have, which is that you will phone the coordinators and go through the flow that Greg talked about, either being allocated to come into a clinic appointment, or indeed you actually would have to go to ED. So this is specifically for the outpatients, but the acute care will still be run through our coordinators and the cystic fibrosis team.
Great, thanks, Dominic. Just going to next steps, I think we can leave the questions up, so if people want to ask us further questions, we'll leave that detail up while I talk through the next steps. Obviously we need to finalise our design now. This patient webinar is one of the steps that we wanted to complete in terms of informing you how our process is going. We've got a bit of work to do in finalising how that reception and waiting space will look and feel at the end of our process. So we've got a separate group working on what that space will look like, given there's other outpatient clinics in the vicinity. Then we need to still do some work with some of the current occupants of these spaces, still need to vacate those areas. There's some redesign and some work going on in terms of who we're locating and where to. Once that's done, we'll be able to get on and get started with our new build. And I guess going into 2018, the real work begins. We've got a brand new design which will work completely differently to how we're currently working in the 5 West space. So we've got a lot of redesign work to do in terms of how do we use these new isolation rooms, how do we make sure that we're designing a system that avoids people waiting for long periods of time or backtracking and getting tests done in various areas. So the redesign work will start in 2018. Once we're a bit surer about when our build will be completed, we'll start that redesign work, so it gives us enough time to really nut through how we want this space to work best for patients. So that's our next steps. In terms of when the build is complete, we'll keep you informed along the way. Obviously we've got some work to do in going out to tender and getting builders, etc., all over the Christmas period, of course, which makes it more fun for our capital team. If you've got some questions from what information we've provided you today, we'd invite you to send those questions into the link on the screen now, and we will endeavour to provide answers to questions as they arise on the website as those questions come in. So I'd just like to thank all of you for joining us today for our first webinar. It's been an experience for all of us as well as you, I'm sure. So I think it's a really positive way of us providing information out to a broad group of patients. So I thank you for joining us, and we'll look forward to the next phase of this project. Thank you so much.